Welcome to It's a Good podcast. My name is Hayden.
I'm Chris.
I'm Harry.
And yeah, we're just a bunch of guys having talks about theology, the Bible, and God. And basically our whole goal is just to be accessible to anyone, that you don't need a theology seminary degree to be able to talk about God. We want to make it easy and simple.
I definitely don't have any of those degrees.
Yeah. That's so true, though. I mean, you just have to be interested in it. All the information's out there.
All right, so we are here in the beautiful mountains of Breckenridge, Colorado, which I think is a fitting place for our topic of sin, because it reminds me of a Garden of Eden kind of setting, which is where the whole sin thing all begins. So yeah, is there any place you guys wanted to start with this conversation?
Well, I think so. I did a little bit of research before we started, and just even looking like when sin came up in the Bible, and we see the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but it's not sin. It's a different word. It means something different. It's the word ra, and it can mean evil, distress, misery, and actually a lot of times it can actually mean injury or harm, which is pretty interesting. And then you also have good, which is, honestly, it's kind of just what we use good for. It can be for benefit or for welfare, but it's just good.
Tov.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so you have that. And then in Genesis 4:7, when the story of Cain and Abel, when God's talking to them, he brings up sin. And that is something different. And the word they're using for that is hatat. But if you want to, you can just say hot too. It's a pretty good way to say it. And it's easy to remember that way. Yeah.
That's actually a really good point too, because I always thought sin was like it started right at the fall.
Right.
Where Eve eats the apple and they get screwed.
Yeah. And I think you could say that, but the Bible doesn't introduce that word there.
No. It introduces it at
Yeah.
Cain and Abel, which that I think is like one of the most colorful descriptions of sin.
Yeah. Yeah, so I thought that was pretty interesting. We don't see the word sin there, but we see them sinning, using their knowledge of good and evil to sin.
Okay, so ra is this word. Is it often used like as an opposite to good? Was that how you'd maybe best describe it?
Yeah, I think so. It means a little bit more than what we would say evil, because you could say they caused evil to those people, which we wouldn't say, but that would be like distress, misery, like they did evil to them, which we wouldn't use it as a verb, but you could use ra that way.
Okay,
yeah,
that's interesting. So let's take a look then at where that word comes up, which would be Genesis 3, and kind of where the whole sin conversation tends to begin in Genesis. So Genesis 1 and 2 is all about God creating all of the universe and setting humans as kind of his pinnacle of creation, putting them in this garden that he has created and saying, all right, your job is to cultivate the land, subdue it, and rule in authority over the animals in a way that's beneficial for everyone, kind of seems to be the narrative. And so then we pick up in Genesis 3, starting with verse 1. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the beasts of the field which the Lord God has made. And he said to the woman, Indeed, has God said, You shall not eat from any tree of the garden? The woman said to the serpent, From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, You shall not eat from it, or touch it, or you will die. The serpent said to the woman, You will not surely die. For God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate. And she gave also to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. So then they hear the voice of God, or they hear God walking around the garden. God says, Where are you? And they're hiding, and Adam says, Well, we knew we were naked, so we hid. And God says, Well, how did you know you're naked? Did you eat from the tree? And Adam goes, The woman that you gave me, she made me sin. And God said, Well, what did you do, Eve? And Eve says, Well, the serpent that was there, he made me do it. And then God pronounces a curse first on the serpent, and then on Eve, and then on Adam, and then banishes them from the garden and sets up some fiery cherubim to guard the entrance and a sword that flashes left and right.
So wait, are we coming off the assumption that this is sin? That what you just said was sin? Because I would actually say no. Like she didn't per the raw word. That's like knowledge of sin, which is why it comes into play in like the next chapter.
Well,
I wouldn't say like that's a sin.
I didn't really talk about sin yet. I talked about evil.
Evil, okay.
Which would be evil, distress.
Yeah.
Distress, misery.
Yeah.
Sin, the way it's used here is really just sin, like wrong, iniquity, like doing something against somebody. And so I think what a lot of people would say is what Eve did was disobey God.
Yeah, there was one rule that God gave them. They had one rule, and that was don't eat from the tree, and she disobeyed that one rule. I think, and so I mean that's a good point. We're not assuming that this is sin. We're just starting here to say that this is kind of the most logical starting point for this conversation, and say let's just explore what is this saying.
Well, in the narrative of the Bible, I think one of the big questions that I ask is like, when did sin come into the picture? Was it something God created, or was it something that humans created? And so, if Eve and Adam were able to sin in perfection, that would lead me to believe that sin was like a God creation. If this action allowed human beings to then, in the next chapter where the actual word sin comes up, to sin, then I would say it's like a man-made or like a devil-made.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's just worth noting that it never calls the Garden of Eden perfection. Just something to say. It says it's very, very good. It's good. Which is just worth saying. It never says it's perfect. So just
there's a
throwing
big
that out
difference
there.
between the two.
We have a conception of the garden that
right.
it is perfect, and that's kind of like a prevalent. I've definitely had that, like when I was raised, like the garden was this perfect place where God set it up to be like exactly how like He wanted creation to be, and I think it's the ideal, and it is very good, but it's just worth noting that the Bible never calls it perfect.
Yeah, and I definitely see what you're saying, Harry, and I think. Some way that I reason with it, I don't know if it's correct or not, is that God created the tree with the knowledge of good and evil. He had that knowledge of good and evil. He even says, these people are like us now. But I think it's the action on that knowledge of good and evil, like taking that knowledge for themselves, was the sin. But not that it was like, I don't know. It was like, it existing wasn't sin, but until they disobeyed God, that was like the sin. It's like that. It's like a free will discussion at a point.
Okay, so how is that different? This might be jumping too far ahead, but how is that different than like chapter 3, where it's like sin is crouching at your door?
Chapter 4.
It's chapter 4. Excuse me. Chapter 4, where it's like sin is crouching at your door. Don't kill your brother. As well as like Jesus' teachings, where he's like, yeah, like if you commit adultery, that's bad, but also if you like look at a woman, that's just the same thing. So like that kind of contradicts what you're saying, where it's like it's not the action that it is a sin,
right? It's
like the premeditation of the action.
Well, I would say almost that like your thoughts can be those actions. Like they weren't able to even think those things until they got that knowledge.
So just a couple things. I've listened to a teacher who talked about like that anyone who looks on a woman with lust in their eyes, and like the word he's really using there, it would be more to like stare and imagine, like you know what I mean,
which is still an action.
If you are committing adultery in your mind, like you're doing it right, that's sin. Like not just like the actual physical action, but also like you can commit mental sin. And so Jesus is taking what had been prevalent in his society, which is like you have to follow these laws, and all the laws are like physical outward displays. And Jesus is saying, I'm here to combat something that's deeper than that. I'm here to go against the evil that like takes root here first.
Well, and like I think the questions behind my persistence here is like, what is sin? Because I don't even truly understand. And then like, why is sin?
Yeah.
Like, because both of those things in the narrative of Genesis are cloudy.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not the first one, but certainly the
I think why is really tough.
Yeah.
I think what like I said before, there's 3 different words that the Hebrew Bible uses for that kind of thing that we translate as sin. The first one is hatat. The second one is pesha, which is transgression, or to trespass. Like that's some ways it's translated. And then also avon, which is perversion or depravity. So it seems like they kind of have different forms of saying that. Whereas in the Greek, you get hamartia, which is basically what we say for sin.
Yeah.
And that's actually, you might have heard this before, it's an archery term. It just means missing the mark.
Dang.
So it's like
That's super cool.
Yeah. So it's like you're going for the target, but you're off, is basically what it is.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful, like, knowing that word background is very helpful. Missing the mark and like putting that in the narrative of the story. And I think, again, we should be looking at Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and 4 and all of that as a theological exploration of God, the universe, and our relationship as humans to God and those things. So what are the authors saying about how humans experience? Because it seems to me that they're not trying to tell us a story of the first time a human sinned, but they're trying to just say, like, this is how humans experience sin or experience evil. Maybe
which is a very realistic portrayal.
Yeah, we'll broaden it out a little bit. And so with that word sin, it's like it is whenever we miss the mark of the ideal, which would be like the garden ideal, where humans are operating under God's wisdom. And then it introduces in Genesis 3 this thought that once we take our good and evil into our own hands and say, like, I'm not sure God's definition of right and wrong is all that good. Like, look at this fruit. It looks good. It's going to give me wisdom. Like, this must be, in my eyes, this must be good.
So is it too much of an extrapolation for me to be like, did God create us to be sinful? Or did God create us as potentially sinful people? Like, I would say that's not what Genesis is trying to tell us. Yeah. That is too much of an extrapolation. But that's a very practical question.
That's a great question. I think that comes down a lot to your, like, views of God, like, in your theology surrounding, like, predestination, free will. Like, I think if you if you say that you believe in free will, then I think, yeah, God created us with the capacity to sin. Not for the purpose of sinning, but because we have the capacity to sin, we also have the capacity to do good.
Yeah. Instead of just being mindless robots. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you know, he set up this perfect place. He gave people the capacity to do either. Maybe, like, you can reason that it would be that if they have the capacity to do good, that's also why they have the capacity to do evil.
So you're somewhat implying that our potential to sin is actually proof of our free will. Yeah,
I think so. And I think the fact that we immediately fall into it all the time shows us, like, how much we need God in that process. And, like, he's created us with the ability to do both. And you see people all over the world, especially people that, like, this is me going off, just so everybody knows is listening. I believe in free will. So this is somebody from a point of free will, as I also believe in prevenient grace. So you'll see people that aren't Christians, and basically what that means is that grace exists outside of Christians and outside of God. Outside of a church, I would say. That God exists everywhere, and that means there can be good everywhere. So you see someone like Bill Gates, it's not a Christian, but still does a lot of good. But he's missing the mark. He's missing the point of it.
He does a lot of good, and he's had a lot of good done to him. Yeah, and that's just because of prevenient grace, which exists.
And so I think people that believe in predestination, a lot of them would say that he's not doing good because he's not in line with what God's telling him to do. He doesn't have that relationship. And even though those things are happening through him, it's not, that doesn't justify what he's doing. It's a mess. But
I was just going to say, there's so many questions that come up and just like that.
Going way back to what you're saying. Yeah, that's what I would say. I'm not, and I think the opposite point of view would be God created some people that have the capacity to be in a relationship with Jesus and thus do good. Only good comes through that relationship with Jesus. And then he created other people that don't have that capacity.
Okay, so I'm going to flip it around. So that actually gives me a better answer as to, like, why is sin. It doesn't, I can answer it fully.
Right.
But then I'd also say, so, like, you're saying that, like, if you do good in the name of Jesus and in God's name, that's like hitting the mark. But, like, I've also, and we're never going to hit the mark.
Right. Or not, at least not sinning.
Okay, but I would also say that I've seen examples of, especially in my own life, sinning leading to hitting the mark. Or, like, sinning reaping good things. So, like, flipping it back around, like, maybe sin is also, like, there to paint the picture of how much grace there really is. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I would just go to that God would use that sin to create good things. And that's what he does. Like, every time we mess up, like, if we go to him with it, I really believe he can, use those terrible things in our life to produce really good things.
I think that much is missed too when you think about the word sin.
Yeah.
Because you think, and even in the Bible, it's like God cannot be around sin. God cannot exist. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he can't manipulate it for good.
Sure. Even look at where we are. We started out as sinning, and he's using that to still make beautiful things in this world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we see, I think, the ultimate picture of God's authority over sin and evil in the picture of Jesus, where sin's number one consequence, or the number one consequence, which is mentioned in Genesis 3 of evil, is death. Mm-hmm. And yet God uses death in his son Jesus and overcomes it to create a new and more beautiful life.
That's bomb.
Yeah. And so I think you're right. Whether, the question of why is sin is a big question and really hard to grapple with. And I agree, it comes, based on your kind of theological points of view, you're going to have different reasons about it. Mm-hmm. But it seems like no matter why there is sin, God still has, at least the biblical narrative seems to be claiming that God still has authority over sin and evil and can use it to create good and create beauty and a rich kind of beauty that maybe we wouldn't experience if there weren't evil. So I think let's just kind of examine these few passages that talk about evil, and I think we should continue starting with Genesis 3 because I think it gives a really in-depth picture of how humans experience sin. Mm-hmm. In that kind of the logic of the narrative is that you have this thing that is wrong. Yeah, Adam and Eve know it's not good, right. And it is against God's rules to eat from this tree. And then we have this other character that shows up and kind of says, well, is it really maybe it's not actually wrong to do this. In fact, maybe it'd actually be a good thing to eat this fruit. I mean, it looks really good. It looks really tasty. And when you eat it, you're going to have this more wisdom that you wouldn't have had before. And then Eve looks at the fruit and she's like, it does look really tasty and it would make me wise. And then she takes it and then she eats it and she gives it to someone else. And I think that's, again, the idea in Genesis 3 is that it's exploring humanity and how we experience God and evil. And I think that picture is so true of how I experience when I know, there's something that in my life that I know is wrong. I know it's wrong to lie, but there's this thing in my voice that's it would be good to lie because then you wouldn't get in trouble for not doing what you were supposed to do or whatever. And I'm like, you know what? It would be good to lie. And then I take that thought in and I'm like, it would be good. And then I do it.
Well, okay. Two things off of that. Number one, the first thing that comes to mind is okay. And maybe these are blasphemous questions to ask. But did God create the snake? Did God create that voice in your mind that's literally shouting at me all the time, actually, Harry, you should rethink the situation because of ... And they're all really good reasons. But I get what you're saying. That when you know something's wrong, there's that voice in your head, whether it's personified as a serpent in the creation narrative or whether it's just the devil in your mind or whatever, telling you that it's okay for A, B, and C.
Yeah.
The other thing is, what about the quandary of okay, what if one of your lies in the Holocaust saves hundreds of Jews? So what about that?
Ooh, that's you're getting philosophical of what it means to do the right thing.
Well, and what is sin? Once again, we just talked for 15, I derailed us for 15 minutes about why is sin.
I think it's a good question.
And now it's what really is sin? Missing the mark. How do I possibly hit the mark? I guess that's the point. Yeah. We can't, but
well, those are good questions to ask. People have been asking for thousands of years. Yeah. I remember talking to people about philosophy, I have somebody like Immanuel Kant that's if you lie for any reason at all, it's a bad thing. Mm-hmm. There's no reason to do that. So I don't know where I would fall under as far as other philosophers go, but I would say I have the ability to reason. God obviously has the ability to reason. Mm-hmm. If I lie to save lives, to subvert evil, then I think God would understand that and benefit that.
does God lie when he tells Abraham that he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah?
Well, see, that's the interesting thing, and I was going to bring that up before, is like, I think as humans, we get driven crazy by not having all the information.
Right.
Because God doesn't really lie, but he doesn't tell you everything. So he might say, I'm going to do this, because that's his plan, but that's a part of the plan. That's not the whole plan. Or like when he tells Adam and Eve, like, don't eat from this because you'll die. It's true, but it's not the whole story. It's also, you will know these things, other things will happen, there's going to be a lot of pain and suffering, and in the end you will die. And like, I think if I have to put myself in Eve's shoes, that's what would be driving me crazy. It's like, yeah, God didn't give me a lot of explanation on this. Like, what's he trying to hide from me?
Yeah. I know one of my biggest pet peeves in the world is the withholding of information from me. Like, when someone tells me to do something, I'll probably 99 times out of 100 be like, nope, unless they explain to me why. And like, as a parent, like, that's something like people tell me to do all the time. They're like, don't just like slap rules on your kid. Explain to them why you want them to do that. Like, eat your vegetables because you'll be healthy, you'll feel better, you'll feel sick if you eat this ice cream and that's it or whatever. Like, I just feel like that's probably not just independent, like, to me, unique to me. That's probably something that's like a human-wide thing.
Yeah,
I agree.
I think you're setting up a kind of a juxtaposition of sin and choosing our own knowledge of good and evil versus faith, and having faith that even in God's limited amount of revelation to us, that we would choose to have faith in what we don't fully know, just because we know that it is God's intent for us. So that was really the choice placed in front of Eve, is, hey, are you going to listen to your own understanding of what is good? Because when you see good, you see it's tasty, and it'll help me be smarter or be wise. And when God sees good, he sees a different picture, and he's saying, you may not understand the full picture of what I see. I'm just asking you to have faith to trust me and not eat.
Well, and to bring that back to like does one lie save like 1,000 lives? If I'm that person in the Holocaust who's like, what I'm thinking is like, I should immediately turn them in, because like then I won't be in trouble, then like my family will be taken care of. But like it probably took like a more than a modicum of faith to be like, actually I'm not going to do that because this is what I think is right or whatever. Like, this is what I know is right. I know that this loss of life would be wrong.
Yeah. It is interesting though, because God doesn't give us that room a lot of places, like the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
And I think, if I had to guess, I would think that God is giving us that space because he knows we have reason. He knows we have the ability to reason and like understand things. But it's like, where does that end? Where does that start? Like, we want a black and white picture, so he gives it to us, but it's impossible to follow.
Well, and are we hitting upon somewhat of a truth? Like, I look at the world in a very gray fashion, which is like actually a part of what kind of drives me away from like contemporary Christianity a lot of times.
Sure, yeah.
Because there are like a lot of answers to things. There's a lot of like black and white. Are we hitting upon somewhat of a universal truth that like, as humans, we will never know what is sin? Like, we'll never have like the dividing line. It's going to be like a situational thing, as well as we have to have faith in those situations.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's some things that would definitely be more often sin than others. Like, murder is a huge one.
Well, the Ten Commandments, like, these things are sin.
But then there's also like the question of war.
Yeah.
Like, where does that fall under? And so I think you're right. I think it's really hard to do the black and white. I think we can't do the black and white, which is why we need Jesus. And I think instead of having that list of rules, we have to go to the Bible and the Holy Spirit. And I would say that's the voice inside of you that's saying this is the right thing to do.
Yeah. So I think the Bible continues to explore this idea with us once we get to Genesis chapter 4. Like, Genesis chapter 3 is a very explicit, like, we have black and white. It is, don't eat the tree.
That's it.
Don't eat from the fruit. Like, God told us for sure don't do this. We know it's wrong, and yet we do it anyway. But then there are this next story of Cain and Abel. And so Adam and Eve have 2 kids, one Cain, one Abel, and we pick up the story. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering, but for Cain and for his offering he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Well, why are you angry, and why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it." Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. So then, once again, we have the same picture of the Lord comes to Cain and says, "Hey, where's your brother Abel?" And Cain says, "Well, am I my brother's keeper?" And God says, "I can hear the blood of your son calling out to me from the ground." And then Cain is given this curse and is cursed to wander the earth. So, we have this next picture where we don't really know. We have these two brothers that take these offerings to God, and we maybe have some context clues of why God regards Abel's versus Cain's, but we don't really know. We're given maybe some clues. It says the first of his flock and the fat portions, and it doesn't say anything about Abel's or about Cain's offering. It just says he brought him some fruit of the field. And so God has regard for one, doesn't have regard for the other, and Cain gets upset. And the Lord meets him there, and he doesn't call that sin. He says, "Hey, why are you upset? Don't you know that if you just do good, that you'll be fine.
You haven't done
you'll
good,
be restored.
And if you do good, everything's gonna be okay."
I don't think he's even saying that you haven't done good yet. I think what he's saying is like, right now you're upset. And that's fine. Like, it's fine to be upset, but just keep doing good, and like you'll be lifted up. But if you don't do good, then sin is crouching and wants to consume you. And so I think it's important to note that's the point. Being upset doesn't seem to be a problem for God. God's like, "Hey, it's fine to be upset, but just keep trying. Like, it's going to be okay."
Right.
But if you give in to your anger, then that thing, it's going to just consume you. And then it does.
And I'm just spitballing. I have no idea why God would respect one over the other, and I don't know if it's effort, but in my mind it would be one took a lot more time and put themselves into it, and the other one didn't.
Well, and I think I'm reading into the text and like doing a little bit of exegesis or whatever, where it's like what I see there is like every other person who's ever been burned by the church, and then like use that as an excuse to do whatever. Like, I totally agree that like so. One thing my sister always says, who's a teacher of third graders, she's like your emotions are okay. She says it in a much smarter way, but she's like, own your emotions. Like, if you're angry, that's natural. Like, if you're sad, that's natural. Like, you should feel that, but it's like your actions after the fact that are going to get you in trouble. Like, I would say that to Roma too. It's like, you can be upset. Like, if you need some time to like go chill out in your room because you're mad, like that's totally fine. Like, I want you to come out and like be okay after that. Like, I want you to act a certain way instead of just like acting on your emotion. What I like, the thing that frustrates me is like it feels like God created this scenario, and it's like another test, and like I don't know, like maybe that's too much, I don't know.
Maybe God thought he could do better, and like it's not even that his wasn't as good as his brother's, but maybe God was like, "I know you can do better, like do better," and I think God challenges all the time. Like he knows like. He gives us a lot of capacity to do great things, and like sometimes I choose to just sit on my butt and watch TV when I could be doing other things, and it's not like God hates me for that.
No,
but
well, I think again, so we have the Genesis 3 passage, which is like when I do something that I know is wrong, like it's wrong, and this is like kind of how it works itself out in my brain. But sometimes I'm doing what I think is good, and other people are benefiting more than I am. Like, how is that fair? And how should I deal with that in my own life? And it seems like the authors here are exploring that idea to say, like sometimes you're trying to do your best, and you see other people that just have like a better outcome than you. So how are you going to deal with that? And it seems like what the authors are saying is that, hey, it's fine to notice that like seemingly unfairness and not understand it and like be upset about it, but don't allow it to like if you dwell in that and if you just let it spin in your brain, that it's crouching there and it's just going to consume you, and you're never going to stop thinking about it, and all of a sudden you're thinking, it would be best is if I kill this guy that's going better, that has stuff going on that's better than what's going on for me.
And like what you just said, I feel like is directly applicable to how I'm interpreting this text. So it's like I read it, and like there are a lot of truths that come out at me, the like things I think that we all agree about, like after reading it. But there's like so much that I can read in between the lines that I dwell on it a lot, and it's very frustrating. And like, does it make me want to like turn away from God and like not read the Bible anymore? Kind of, but like I don't. And I think that's probably like that would be like coming back to what you just said, like an example of.
Well, I think that's the frustration of a lot of people reading Genesis.
Yeah.
We see these stories that are telling us very simple things or maybe very crazy things, but we try to pull out things that are just not there,
not written into.
And we're trying to like, okay, why him? Why not him? When it really isn't for us to know, and that's not the point of the story. And I think that's why people hate a lot of Genesis.
Yeah.
Now we've talked about that before with creation. Like there's a lot of hatred around Genesis.
There is. Like
we try to pull things out of it that probably aren't supposed to be pulled out of it.
Yeah. No, me definitely being one of those people. It's hard for me to read and not be frustrated. It's hard for me to read and be like, this is the first chapter of the most important book on the planet. Like it's just really hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, well I think that the biblical narrative takes these ideas of sin and just like continues to extrapolate and extrapolate and extrapolate. And like the next big story that stands out to me is Abraham and Sarah. And God has this plan to say, okay, even though humanity has constantly chosen their own way, like I have this plan that's going to redeem humanity and it's going to be a blessing to all humanity, and I'm going to enact this plan through this guy, Abraham. And what I'm going to do for you, Abraham, is I'm going to give you a huge family that's like a blessing to the nations, and they're going to be my chosen people. And when people look at your family, like they're going to see that God is good, and they're going to see like what God can do for a people. And so he gives this promise, and then just like sits on it for like 20 years.
Oh, yeah.
And Abraham and Sarah are like 100 years old, and they're looking around, and they're like, "Okay, God had this promise to like fulfill our human
I ain't
nation.
got no children.
Yeah, but I don't have any children, so I think what I need to do is take matters into my own hands and
help God out a little bit.
Yeah, we need to help God out a little bit. So we pick up in Genesis 16, and it says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife," at this time they're called Sarai and Abram. They get name changes later.
No breath yet.
Yep. "Now Sarai and Abram's wife had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarah said to Abram, 'Now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I will obtain children through her.' Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight." So we have this story, and when we listen to it, right after having listened to the Genesis 3 narrative, there's a ton of parallels. So we have this thing that God has promised, that Sarah is gonna have children. She knows that that's what the case is, but then she starts to think in her mind that maybe she needs to have children in a different way, and so she takes Hagar and gives her to Abram, and Abram listens to the voice of his wife and goes into Hagar sexually and has a kid.
Yeah.
Very similar wordings, and I think very intentional to say, like, this is a replay of Genesis 3 in a new context, where this time the context is, I know that something good is supposed to be coming from God, but I don't know when, and I'm going to take it into my own hands.
Yeah. And it's interesting that she says prevented too. Like God is actively against her. That she's like perverting what he said. And just saying, no, like instead of giving us children, he's actually doing the opposite. So she's like trying to basically go against God. Like not even under the assumption, like we said, like helping God out. It's like flat out, no, he's not doing it, and he's actively against me, so I'm going to make sure that you have children.
Yeah. So I think what it seems to me that this part of the narrative is continuing to expand on the sin conversation is that, okay, we can have sin when it's black and white, like we know that God says don't do this thing, and then we do it, that's sin. We also have times when we get jealous or we get angry, and we can allow that emotion to like spin us into this place where all of a sudden we think it's good to kill somebody or something like that, which we know is not good.
Yeah.
Then we have these other times where we fully believe that God we've been told that God, there's hope in life and like there's promise in life, but we don't see it, and we start to think, like you said, that God is actually not working for me, like he's working against me. And so in order to have a family, or in order to have good in my life, whatever the promise is for us in our own individual context, I gotta take this into my own hands, and I gotta just make it happen. Like I don't have any faith.
I think that thought process is really practical for us in 2019. I always say that, but like I think it is, because I don't necessarily think that a lot of Americans or people in this day and age think to themselves like, God is preventing me from having a good life. But I do think they think he's forgotten, or like he doesn't care, or he's like, if there is a creator, he doesn't care about me, this individual, one of 7 billion people. So then, like, I think it's not just like a situational thing where it's like, oh, I need to do this now. I think it's like a daily thing where like I need to take my life in my own hands. Like I do not have faith that like the Lord's going to provide. Like I need to do this, I need to do that, I need to be, I think there are a lot of societal things that tell us that, but I also think there's a lot of like us in our own heads being like, I gotta do these things.
Yeah. I mean, Abraham was no better. Again, a lot like Genesis 3. Just was okay with it.
Yeah, there's a lot of, and I think we should probably debunk the whole like, why is it the females like always doing that stuff? Like, because I think of many situations in my life where I was the Sarai or the Eve, the instigator in those sinful situations.
Right. I think what we can get out of it is if you are in that relationship or in any relationship, you should be preventing the other people from sinning. Mm-hmm. So Abram's role here was to prevent that from happening and saying, no, like, be patient, wait for God. Adam's role was to say, no, we're not supposed to do that. Let's not do that. So whether or not it's the guy or the girl, I don't think really matters, but it's speaking up when things are going wrong and not just going along with it.
That's so hard.
Yeah, and it's not like every single instance of sin in the Bible is derived from a woman. I think like obviously that is clearly not the case.
Cain and Abel right after it.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's maybe just a literary device that they use in this one specific context to be very, very clear that this is sin on Abraham's part. So I think it's really interesting then going to that juxtaposition that we talked about later is we have a juxtaposed story then that takes place after that where Isaac is born to Sarah in her old age, and God then asks Abraham to take Isaac to the top of a mountain and to sacrifice him to the Lord, and Abraham in that moment, it has total faith that God is going to provide a way through this. And even though in his own mind, he could easily reason that it is not good for me to go and sacrifice my son on the top of this mountain. And so, but we know that God does then halt that and says, Abraham, like, you have faith, like, I'm going to bless you, like I said you were going to. And so we have this juxtaposed stories where I didn't have faith that God was going to provide, so I took matters into my own hands. And perhaps that experience and like how bad it ended up being, we thought it was going to be a good thing. We were going to have a kid and like our family was going to be restored, but it ended up causing these huge tensions in my family where Sarah now hates her stepson or half-son or whatever.
Sends him away. Wants to send him away.
Wants to send him away. We have a ton of issues in the family. And so it really ended up being a really bad thing. So this time when God asked me to have faith, like, I'm gonna do it, and it has this refining effect
Yeah.
where now Abraham is shown as a man full of faith in God, as opposed to earlier when he didn't have faith.
I'll just say too, it is so much easier to talk about Jesus than it is to talk about the Old Testament. Like, and once again, here we have another story, Abraham and Isaac, which is just like thoroughly displeasing to my ears.
Yeah.
Using those words specifically, like it, and like, yes, I get what the story, like the juxtaposition tells us, have faith in God no matter what.
Yeah.
But like, I can't get over the fact that God asked Abraham to kill his son. Like,
Yeah.
I can't get over that. Like, it's so frustrating to me. What the heck?
Yeah.
And
When I see that
you don't need
story,
to answer that.
no,
yeah.
I know. I think it's a messed up story, and I think there's a reason it is so intense and, frankly, like, really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I think it's because, and again, I'm not saying this like takes the insanity out of it, but because it is that way, God is setting the precedent, saying, this is how much faith you need to have in me.
Even in this scenario,
Yeah.
which is like the worst scenario that anyone can possibly think of.
And you went from one that was pretty bad, like over 100 not getting what you were promised.
Don't eat some fruit.
Yeah.
Maybe I should have a child with somebody else because I can't have one with you. To like, kill your son. Like, let's escalate the intensity of the situations so we can also escalate the
let's read it just so we have all the actual
vomit.
context. Yeah. So this is Genesis 22,
22.
starting with verse 1. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. He said, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So,
well, it's super cool mirroring that with what God says about Jesus. Let's just get back into the bright side of life. God is literally like, this is my son whom I love. Like, those words are chosen very important.
Yeah.
And like, I always thought of that as like just like a statement about his love, but it's also like, I'm gonna kill this guy.
Think about that too, though. Like, God asked a man to do that, and he didn't make him go through with it.
Yeah.
But God put that on himself.
Does it himself.
And went through with it.
Yeah.
So God also says, it says right here, now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham.
Want to vomit there.
So vomit.
Yeah. What the heck? Like, so I feel like there's a lot of examples of testing, and they're all screwed up. Like, that's what I'm saying. It's so easy to talk about Jesus, because even when Jesus challenges you, it's like, oh, you know what? I think Jesus is right. I think he's actually, like, he spelled it out for me in a parable. I get it. Like, this is a messed up test. You know, like, oh man.
I mean, I don't know if this helps at all. Just make it even worse.
Give me the word.
But one translation for this word is to give experience to.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Does that just add another layer of like, why do I need this experience?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, putting it back into the juxtaposed stories, I think in either the giving, like the testing or the giving, God knows what the outcome of the story is going to be.
Right.
And he is proving maybe to Abraham or proving to, some other entity that we could talk about later, that Abraham is indeed now a man of faith, even though he demonstrated himself to be a man of not faith earlier. Which goes to an interesting fact that just because Abraham sinned in like a very grievous way to take matters into his own hand, God offers redemption through faith in God, which I think is the biblical picture of Jesus too. Like, although we do sin and we commit grievous sins, like there is redemption through faith in Jesus, and we would go back to our salvation story on that.
I think more of my vomit though. This story makes me think that I would fail the test. Because I wouldn't do that.
Well, I think that's a normal reaction. I think most people at this time wouldn't do what Abraham did, and that's why it had to be Abraham. I don't know. It's for the story, whatever. It's really hard to sit down and read this and go, this is a loving God that's doing this.
Yeah.
Link it back to what we were talking about earlier. Like, this again is God not giving somebody all the information, but asking them to have faith anyway. Like, God has a plan, and we need to trust that even if we don't know the end result is going to be good.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's worth stating too that God chooses, I would say, at least I would say that God chooses this specific test for a very specific reason.
Yeah.
Because it was the highlight problem for Abraham. God knows that Abraham's biggest deal was his family, and that he's old, and that he has this promise for God that he's going to have like a restored and huge family. And so God is meeting Abraham where he's at and saying, hey, this is the one thing that you couldn't let go of earlier. Like, are you ready to like trust me in it now? Are you ready to take it out of your own hands and put it in my hands? And Abraham says yes. And something that I like that you've said a lot is Jesus knows and God knows what that thing is. And there's, probably a lot of things for each of us. But the story of the rich man, where the rich man comes up to Jesus and he's like, hey, Jesus, like, what do I have to do to enter the kingdom of God? And Jesus is like, well, like, what do you think? And the guy's like, well, I'm a really good person. Like, I follow all the 10 commandments. And Jesus is like, yeah, totally. Yeah, you followed all the 10 commandments. Like, you have been a really good person. But are you willing to give up all your riches and follow me? And the guy turns away and is upset because that's the one thing that he's held on to. And one thing that you've said, Chris, many times is like, if it was someone else, like, Jesus probably would have said something different. And in this case, it was Abraham. Like, hey, yeah, you've been following the 10 commandments, but are you ready to like give up your family for the sake of me? Yeah. And I think God meets each person where they're at. And it's worth noting too that there are a lot of places where God doesn't ask people to give up their families. Yeah. He like blesses them and uses their family to further his kingdom and his good news,
Yeah. Just makes me want to believe it's all metaphorical, historical. Well, I don't know.
I think this isn't really a parallel, but to go on what you're saying, like God challenging people with what bothers them the most, like reminds me of Jonah and like getting sent to the Nineveh. Basically, he was a racist, and he got sent to people that were of the race he hated, like specifically hated the city. God called him exactly where he needed to be to give up like that thing, and he didn't, but God still worked through him. But yeah, I truly believe that, and I think you're right. Like everything that matters to not only Abram but his family is Isaac. It has to be Isaac, and like God saying, "I gave you Isaac. Like, do you trust me with Isaac?"
I think we're touching on two different points too. We've talked about sin. We're also talking about like redemption following sin, which I think is really important to highlight, because the picture of sin we've kind of discussed is like impossible for us to paint perfectly. It's impossible for us to like make the scale or like make the rules outside of the 10 commandments. Redemption through sin, especially in light of Jesus, is like a very, very heartwarming way to end it.
Well, I think that's totally true, and I think kind of what I'm seeing as now a big theme in all of this is that God tells us that He is the giver of all good things, and like He gives good as He sees fit to give good, and He takes things as He sees fit to take things, but it's all under the umbrella of like His good plan and His good wisdom. Right. And our responsibility is to continue to have faith that He is the giver of good things, and that if something is taken or something that we think would be good for us but we know is not of God, that it's not actually good. And so like you start here, and God says like, hey, here's this good garden that I've given you to inhabit, and I've given you all the good things, and I will provide for you all the good things while you are here. And Eve is like, I feel like there's this one good thing that I could take for myself that would actually be good. And we see that theme like in every story where God is reiterating like, if anything is good, it is coming from me. And even though you take things into your own hands and you see what is good in your own eyes, I have the ability to take that and still use it for good and to redeem you. But you've got to, like, the main thing is you've got to have faith that I'm the one who's giving the good things.
I wish they would have written it like that. I think it's just challenging. And like I was not alive thousands and thousands of years ago when Genesis was written, so like it was probably taken in a little less inflammatory way by the readers at that time.
I was going to say, I don't think this story of Abraham and Isaac is ever going to get easier to read as we go on. As war affects us less personally, not that it doesn't exist in the Western world. But every time we see this kind of stuff, like with death and murder, we're so far from it, it's really hard to read. Which, for them, frankly, it was just part of life. Not that they were okay. Not that Abraham was ever okay with killing his son.
Right.
You know, he had faith that it would work out. But I guarantee you, man, he was weeping.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, and when Isaac asks him, hey, we've got the fire and we've got the wood, but what about the offering? He doesn't say, you're the offering.
Yeah.
He says, God will provide.
Yep.
You know, and I think that is exactly what kind of the narrative is. So I think we've identified a lot of what is sin, and do you think we've come to a semi-conclusion of why is sin?
I don't know. I think it's telling that like this is the most troublesome topic for me. Like I've not gotten as ticked off in our previous conversations as I have in this one. So like sin as a subject is very troubling.
Yeah, I think too it's good to note that even when in the narrative, when the first sin enters, or when evil enters the picture and has an effect on humanity, that God instantly promises a remedy to that. And it's in Genesis 3, and he's talking to the snake, which is this, embodiment of evil.
Yeah.
And it says, because you've done this, cursed are you more than all the cattle and more than any beast of the field. On your belly you will go, and dust you will eat all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. And a lot of translations, which I think would actually be better in this case, will say like crush the head, and saying like, hey, you're going to continue to harm humanity, but eventually there will come this human that is a crusher of evil, and will bring it.
There's the feel-good statement that I was looking for. Is that like our whole point is like trust God's promise.
Yeah.
Regardless of like how hard it is to believe. Like even if you're 100 years old and you don't think you can have kids, like trust. Like God promised that at some point, maybe with Jesus, maybe in the future, sin was going to be crushed. It was going to be vanquished.
I think you're exactly right. And when we look at all of this mess, we need to remember this is just part of what it takes to get Jesus here.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's what Jesus is saying in his message too. Is like, here's going back, kind of all of our conversations wrapped up at this point, saying like, okay, sin is when we miss the mark of having faith in God. And it makes sense that you could read this story and say, well, God promised that he was going to crush the head of sin, and he doesn't seem to be doing that. Yeah. I'm looking around and all I see is a kingdom of sin. And Jesus says, the kingdom of God, which has crushed sin, is here.
Yep.
Here's what it looks like. And then I will even demonstrate that it has the power over that one consequence that you can't escape, which is death.
Right.
And so I'm going to conquer that as well. And it takes faith for us now to believe that kingdom exists, that God's kingdom has authority here on earth, where we see an authority of sin running rampant in the world, and to believe and to have faith that God has some amount of authority over that, I think is a huge, it's a lot, it takes a lot of faith. I think that's what Jesus's message was, is like, have faith in me, the conqueror of sin, that sin has been conquered and that its consequences are dealt with, even though it seems to you that they probably haven't been. So this week we talked about sin and kind of how it's juxtaposed with faith, and having faith in Jesus' kingdom, that his kingdom is here, and that his kingdom has power and authority over death, and that there will come a day, or perhaps has come a day, when sin has been dealt with, and there will be a new creation, a new kingdom. So, new creation / kingdom next week.
Next week.
Cool.